And so they have been discredited, but that doesn't mean that they've been silenced or they would stop advocating for what they've been advocating for years, including, by the way, by smearing and discrediting people who have been vindicated by the development, which are the diplomacy camp.
It's not just Israel. Iran has its hardliners. Washington has its hardliners. They're all against this deal, all against any kind of memorandum of understanding, any kind of peace deal between the United States and Iran. They all are opposed to peace, basically, and they all are working in their own ways to damage this memorandum of understanding and to make it so that it doesn't come to fruition. Why? They have various reasons. And for that, we're joined today by Ali Vaez. He is a really great, really smart Iran expert at the Crisis Group, which is an international conflict resolution and advocacy organization based in Brussels with a huge presence in Washington. I am Borzou Dergahi. This is my podcast. It's called Badlands, and you can subscribe at Borzou, Borzou, Substack.com. I'm also on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts and on YouTube. Ali, thank you so much. Welcome. Thank you so much for your time and for joining me.
It's my pleasure. Great to see you, Borzou.
Great. You know, we used to live in Istanbul at the same time together. I remember you guys had the ICG had like a little rooftop party once. I think that was the first time I met you. It was a wonderful time here. Great weather, I remember. So yeah, and where are you now? Where are you these days?
I'm based in Geneva now. After Istanbul, I moved
great.
to DC. I was there for a long time, almost 10 years, but I've been in Geneva.
Great. So let me ask you, let's talk about the spoilers, the people who don't want this deal to actually come to fruition. And I guess the first and possibly the worst and most powerful spoiler is Donald Trump himself. He's the one who wanted this deal. According to Iranians, the Americans started, through Steve Witkoff, asking for a return to negotiations just days after the war began, when it became really obvious that it was not going to be a cakewalk, that the Iranian regime wasn't going to collapse. And according to the Iranian officials and insiders, they were begging for some kind of resolution. Okay, let's end it. Let's walk away. And the Iranians were like, no way. So what do you think? What about these erratic signals that Donald Trump is giving out? How effective of a spoiler could he be, and what role is he playing right now in these negotiations other than damaging his own negotiators' credibility?
Right. Well, I would say it goes way further back than that. I would argue that President Trump could have had a deal with Iran in 2017, 2018, if he had adopted a much more reasonable approach in the way that he is adopting now, after basically trying every other policy that failed or backfired. But he has been his worst enemy when it gets to negotiating, because the tone he adopted just from the get-go towards the Islamic Republic, very insulting, very tough rhetoric, quite different than the rhetoric that he adopted against a lot of other authoritarian states, calling President Sisi his favorite dictator, treating Kim Jong-un with a lot of respect, and so on. But in the case of the Islamic Republic, obviously added insult to injury by taking military action against the regime in 2020 by killing Soleimani, last year by bombing Iran in a limited fashion, but nevertheless crossing a line. And now I would argue that during the diplomatic engagement, he just can't help himself. He moves the goalposts. He changes what is considered to be, already accepted in the text. He gets cold feet. He continues to threaten them, even now in violation of the memorandum of understanding. Its first clause is basically that both sides commit not to pose a threat to each other, or not even to threaten to use force against one another. So that discipline is just lacking. The cultural understanding about Iran is lacking. He has continuously surrounded himself by people who either had no interest in coming to a mutually beneficial agreement with Iran. That was the case in his first term. I would say even in his second term, the likes of Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz, ambassador to the UN, and so on. Or he hasn't surrounded himself by people who just didn't know how to do it, like Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. So yes, he has been an obstacle on his own way to reach an agreement with Iran.
With regard to Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner, what is their motives here? They have their own self-interest. There's obviously a lot of self-dealing here. During the previous rounds of talks, it was rumored that they were constantly in touch with Benjamin Netanyahu. Jared Kushner himself is a family friend of the Netanyahus, longtime family friend. Can they be serving? Let me put it this way. Is there any evidence that they are shifting their approach to serving the stated U.S. goal of ending this conflict? Or do their actions and words suggest that they are continuing to serve as kind of proxies for Israel?
So it's a tough question because I remember last year when talks started with Steve Witkoff, he seemed genuinely interested in getting a deal and even thinking outside of the box, coming up with ideas that were at times quite puzzling to the Iranians, including, the U.S. offering to purchase Iran's nuclear, a business kind of idea that it sounds very bizarre to people who are familiar with the technical background of these negotiations. But I think the best summary of Witkoff's approach last year was by a former member of his team who told me that these talks were serious but not professional. And I don't think that they were, as Iranians believe, a ruse to basically prepare the ground for military action against them under cover of diplomacy. I think he was trying to see if he can deliver for his boss, President Trump, but he just didn't know how to do it, didn't have the skills, didn't understand the issue. This year, with Kushner joining, I think that sort of Israeli skepticism, cynicism towards the utility of engaging with this regime was also introduced to the negotiations. I heard some of the briefings that the two of them did after the war started, and it was pretty clear they didn't really understand what Iran was offering them on February 26th in Geneva, 2 days before the war started. So again, was that all because they were primarily trying to serve Israel's interest, or because they were just honestly incompetent and couldn't do what was given to them? I'm not in their head, it's hard to say. But the result is the same. The result is that Israel got what it wanted for a long time, which was to bring the United States into a direct confrontation with Iran with the aim of not changing the regime's behavior, but changing the regime itself. And it failed miserably and it backfired. So regardless of what the intention was, the result is fundamentally different from what Israel or its allies had in mind.
Going to the other side, there was a fascinating story about a hardline member of Iran's parliament, and he was on state television speaking out against this memorandum of understanding, and in a kind of what I described as a sort of Barry Weiss style canceling moment, Tehran style, they basically just cut him off. They cut off the broadcast and went to a commercial or, a Penguin documentary or something. So there are those voices in Tehran. They don't seem to have the upper hand for now. That could change. But, we have to acknowledge that there are powerful forces in Iran who don't want to deal and want to go back to war. What do you know about them? I know you speak in dual tracks and sometimes directly with the Iranian officials, negotiators, and so on. What are they saying about, who's nipping at their heels, demanding that they not get into this deal and go back to confrontational mode?
So I think there are three categories of opponents in Tehran. One is, and Nabavian sort of represents that camp. People who are...
That's the member of parliament that I was referring to. Yes.
Exactly. And he, in my head, is sort of mirror image of Lindsey Graham. These are people who are fundamentally opposed to any kind of deal making with the United States, right? I mean, they just believe that the U.S. Animosity towards Iran is just, it's not fixable. It's not. It's a permanent feature. It's not something that could be managed or adjusted in any way. And they believe that, Iran had the upper hand in the conflict and should not have come to agree to give away some of its leverage and one of the most important pieces of leverage, which was its control over the Strait of Hormuz. So these people, just like, Lindsey Graham's and Tom Cotton's, Cruz's of the world, they're not going to be satisfied with any kind of deal. And this camp is primarily the camp of the steadfast faction, the Haidari faction.
Haidari,
exactly. Yeah. They have lost a lot of influence since Khamenei's killing. But their last vestige of influence is in the state television. They are starting to lose that as well. So they are loud, they're very vocal, but they're a small minority. The second camp are people in the Revolutionary Guards who actually don't have much ideological alignment with Haidari. But they did believe that Iran was in a situation, especially towards the end of the war, when Israel was targeting Iranian infrastructure. And the Iranian response was not on par to the damage that Israel was inflicting. If you think about the fact that in the course of the 40-day war, less Israelis were killed than in the course of the 12-day war, that Iran in the recent war targeted the UAE more than it targeted Israel. These are people who say, yes, maybe we established a degree of deterrence against the United States and the Gulf states, but we didn't really deter Israel. So they are making a point from a military perspective, that Iran had to finish the job, to mirror image the arguments on the other
Ali,
side.
sounds familiar, to finish the job. But Ali, was that a matter of capability, or was that a matter of tactic, not to hit Israel as hard as it could and to not inflict a proportionate amount of damage against Israel?
So again, members of this camp that I talked to, they tell me it was a tactical choice because Iran believed that this war is going to last for 6 months. They didn't believe that Trump will pull the plug on it in 40 days, and they really needed to be able to retain enough residual retaliatory capacity so that if the war becomes an attritional conflict, they would be able to stay in the and this is why they opted not to in 2024 and 2024 go with these like big bodies of missiles and drones firing towards Israel, but to keep a steady pace in order to have a psychological and an economic impact. But when Israel targeted infrastructure, they didn't really respond in a way that would deter Israel from doing so in the future. So that's a second camp of opponents. And finally, there's a third camp who have vested economic interest in the status quo. And they just don't want to lose their ability to benefit from circumventing sanctions. Now that, for instance, even in the course of the MOU implementation, 60-day period, the U.S. has provided the kind of sanctions relief that allows Iran to repatriate its revenue without having to go through these, schemes to go around U.S. sanctions. And a lot of people were being enriched through those schemes. So this obviously is in the interest of the state, but not in the interest of the subgroup of people that I was talking about. So these are the collective three groups of opponents of the deal in Iran.
Yeah. When you talk to them, when you talk to the Iranians, what do they think is the dynamic? How can they sell what do they need from the Americans to sell it to the hardliners? Or have they so consolidated their power and is the consensus to negotiate so powerful that they don't really need to sell it to the hardliners?
They don't really need to sell it to the hardliners, even though the new supreme leader, taking a page from his father's playbook, is hedging his bets. But this is more of a power consolidation, legacy building issue than because he's afraid of the opponents of the agreement inside Iran. He basically, and you can see that a lot of the opponents use Moshtaba Khamenei's statement, who said, the president asked me to agree to this deal, and despite my reservations, I gave him the authorization. They're saying that basically the negotiating team didn't comply with Moshtaba Khamenei's requirements, which was not to discuss the nuclear issue at this stage. There are some elements in this text about the nuclear issue. They're not substantive at all, but they're using some of these elements or some of the American arguments that, for instance, the money can only be used to purchase American agricultural products as evidence that the negotiating team has crossed some of the Supreme Leader's red lines. But again, the very fact that this deal happened is indicative to me of the reality that the Supreme National Security Council in Iran, which is in charge of consensus building for all these key decisions, was on board with this deal, that people who negotiated it, like Talibov, really represent the deep state in Iran, and that it would not have happened unless everybody, including Moshtaba Khamenei, was on board. And they do believe that they can be
Does Ghalibaf represent the deep state in Iran? Is he too much of a populist kind of figure or aspiring populist figure? Is he too much of a showboat? He seems to really like the public limelight. Can a character like that really represent the internal, and you know what I'm talking about, the darker forces inside the regime that run the prisons and really run the security apparatus, the hard power inside the country?
I do believe that he does represent them for now. Of course, once the dust settles on this war, we might see fissures emerging. But at this moment, the constellation of figures who are running the show, they're all Ghalibafs. I mean, like they all went to war together, Iran-Iraq war. They've been friends and colleagues for almost 4 decades. So I'm talking about the likes of the new National Security Advisor, Mohammad Bagher Zolghad, who tried to make Ghalibaf president as early as 2000 when he ran against Ahmadinejad at the time. Or the likes of the head of the Revolutionary Guards. These people have known each other for a very long time and have been part of the deep state for a very long time. Now, Ghalibaf, I would say, you're right, is probably more ambitious than most of them. He has tried to reach the pinnacle of power multiple times. He has not succeeded. But now, the process of elimination facilitated by Israel, he finally has a lot of power. Now, we will have to see whether he can consolidate once the war is done, or whether other elements of the system would use him to get through this phase of confrontation with the U.S. and would then try to bring him down. It's too soon to judge, but as you know, there are also serious cases of corruption against him. By the way, he has been involved in repression as well, in the same way that a lot of other, like Ghalibaf, as you remember, when he was the head of the police, he bragged about the fact that he was involved in the crackdown against student protesters in 1999. But, Zolghad was involved in crackdown against the protesters in the Green Movement. Bahidi was involved in crackdown against women life freedom protesters and so on. So all of them share a similar background. The question now, I think, for this group as an entity is that, they have survived the hot war. That's an impressive achievement. But they need to survive the cold peace. And in order to do that, they need to be able to recover and reconstruct. And Iran now is not where it was after the Iran-Iraq war, when it had no limitation on its ability to sell oil and reconstruct the country. But now it does. And so it does need either a deal with the West or a way out with the East. And so this group is still not out of the woods yet.
Yeah. Just very quickly, one of the interesting things that happened over the last week or so was when there was talk of removing some United Nations Security Council resolutions, France, out of nowhere, came in and said that any removal of sanctions that's not tied to the downblending of enriched uranium or the dismantling of Iran's nuclear program would be vetoed by France, basically warning that France and other UN Security Council members, possibly Great Britain, could veto any U.S. deal that they didn't like as well. Was this a bluff, or was this actually some kind of concern that the European powers have right now after ignoring this conflict or being acquiescent to it for all these months?
So I would say two things to that. One is that the Europeans stunningly have been completely sidelined from this process, and that has created a lot of frustration. And I read statements like this as an attempt to regain relevance. But also, to be honest with you, I would be interested to see if President Trump actually gets a final agreement. There are some non-proliferation terms that France is uncomfortable with. What happens when President Trump threatens a tariff on French champagne or wine if they don't agree to the deal? And it'll be interesting to watch.
Yeah, that's interesting. Another really interesting development over the last few days or so is the mixed signals coming from the Gulf. On the one hand, you have Marco Rubio visiting Manama. He is talking with the Kuwaitis, Bahrainis, and the Emiratis, trying to assure them, apparently, that their interests will be secured in any future negotiation. And on the other hand, you have this parallel diplomatic effort, apparently led by Saudi Arabia, this quadripartite group that includes Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Egypt, and Turkey, as well possibly as Qatar, and on the sidelines, Oman, apparently trying to get their own diplomatic track together, separate to essentially ecumenical to the U.S. diplomacy and perhaps even hostile to Israel's ambitions. What do you think of the Gulf's role in this? Could they prevent a deal from coming to fruition? What are the vibes that you're getting from the Gulf countries about how they feel about this memorandum of understanding and how they feel about this negotiation?
Yeah, so first of all, we wouldn't have this memorandum of understanding if it wasn't because of all the efforts that the group of mediating countries that you mentioned I think they like calling themselves the four, Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, had put into this,
Why
along
are
with Qatar, a regional force.
I see. Okay.
But of course, also the role that Qatar played is so important. Again, without it, I don't think we would have had a deal. So now you have a group of countries in the region who have come to the conclusion that the two-track policy that the Gulf countries were pursuing, which was egging on the United States to contain Iran and provide them with a security umbrella on the one hand, and also engage Iran by just being nice to them on the other hand, hasn't really delivered results. So now they're trying something new, which is a serious regional security dialogue. And also engagement with Iran in the form of investments in the country, which would give them leverage. None of this means that they will cut off their security reliance on the United States. There is just simply no viable alternative available at this point. They can start hedging their bets, buying some technology from Ukraine, hoping that Pakistan would extend its nuclear umbrella to them. But none of that really translates into immediate change in their relationship with the U.S. They have some difficult, issues to deal with, including, do they rebuild some of these U.S. facilities that are totally destroyed? Does it make sense to rebuild them the way they were, given the fact that they, in fact, made them a target of Iranian attacks, not only didn't deter, but invited Iranian strikes, and they will remain vulnerable to Iranian strikes in the future. So does it make sense to rebuild them? There are lots of questions that they would have to answer. And then there is the question of the division that you mentioned, the countries that suffered the most of Iranian attacks, the UAE, Bahrain, and Kuwait. Of course, the UAE and Bahrain are in the Abraham Accords, and so there is now sort of a fragmentation along the question of whether you continue to double down on the U.S.-Israeli axis or you try to bring Iran in from the cold. And there is also a decision for the Gulf to make on that dilemma. Is the UAE, which just a few weeks ago sounded still very much, being in the camp of U.S. and Israel and finish the job and defang the Iranian system, actually has now sent senior security officials to engage the Iranian leadership. Have they realized that their bet didn't deliver? Are they going to gingerly join this regional security dialogue, which will hopefully start soon? Or would they double down on the U.S.-Israeli axis? There's lots of questions that I think leaders in the region are trying to figure out answers to. But again, the dust on this conflict hasn't fully settled, so it's a plastic moment where things can go either.
You also have Israel, of course, and they are definitely against any kind of negotiations with Iran. And Benjamin Netanyahu is also in a tough situation. His political opponents at home smell blood, and they see him as having pursued this, what they are describing as a march of folly. It's unclear whether they would themselves, whether Naftali Bennett or other rivals would have done it the same way. They were not defined by Iran the way Netanyahu was. So maybe they could make that argument in elections. But what role could we'll talk about the Israel lobby and Israel's allies in the U.S. momentarily. But just for now, what can Netanyahu do from Israel? What tools does he have at his disposal to try to sabotage this deal? Of course, there is the Lebanon card. Are there any other ways that he can make sure that, or try to enforce his perception that these talks should not take place?
Well, look, I think the card that he played twice already, which is the threat proposition that either Iran's nuclear program was on the verge of weaponization, which was the sort of argument he used in 2025, or that Iran's missile program was reaching a stage that Iran basically had the North Korea option. North Korea can destroy South Korea using both conventional and unconventional weapons, right? So he was saying that Iran's ballistic missiles are reaching a stage that they have too many to threaten a small state like Israel. Both of those arguments, I think, have been discredited, along with the key argument of Iranian regime being so weak and so vulnerable that it's on the verge of collapse. None of those arguments would work anymore. I think they've been discredited. So the only remaining cards are, political pressure on President Trump, who's sensitive to criticism. And again, we can talk about that later. And he has many ways of generating that political pressure in Washington without doing what he did with the Obama administration, which was to spearhead the effort himself, basically. And then the second option is Lebanon, as you mentioned, remains a point of vulnerability in this understanding. Because as long as Israel is occupying southern Lebanon, there will be inevitably clashes between Hezbollah and Israel. And that would be used, again, to undermine U.S.-Iran diplomacy. And finally, and historically, there have been false flag operations that Israel has conducted and has tried to blame Iran. And that's another risk that exists. But a lot of this, I think there's a limit to the utility of a lot of these tactics, because at the end of the day, I think President Trump has been disillusioned with the use of coercive force against Iran to achieve his objective.
What about, for example, launching an airstrike on Mohammed Bakr Ghalibaf, killing the negotiators again, which is something that Israel has tried to do in the past. For example, when it launched airstrikes on Qatar last year in an attempt to kill the Hamas negotiators. Would that do it for the talks?
Well, it will, but it would also burn his remaining bridges with the Trump administration. Again, because, I would argue if Netanyahu had kept his powder dry, he had not done the 12-day war, he had not done the attack on Qatar, and he had done this big war against Iran this year, he might have actually succeeded. But, by starting to burn some of his cards with Trump, by giving the Iranians...
And the American public as well.
And the American public, and giving the Iranians enough time to prepare for a big confrontation with the U.S. and Israel, he basically defeated himself. And again, I do believe that he has very little maneuvering space left to him at this point.
Yeah. Now, moving on to Washington, where the real threat to the big threat to the whole deal is, I suppose, using your same analytical framework that you used for Tehran, I guess there are a number of different constituencies in Washington that are opposed to the deal and could potentially put pressure on Trump to either move away from it or sabotage it or checkmate him. I guess you have a number of different factions, so to speak, inside Washington. What would you describe those? Who would you describe those factions as?
Well, look, unlike in Iran, I don't think this is a case in which, this is a question of, military calculations, because for sure, the United States could have prevailed militarily if it was willing to pay the cost. It's the world superpower. Of course, it could have opened the Strait of Hormuz with force, but it would have come at a cost that didn't really make sense to justify the benefit. And those debates, I don't think are, the military arguments are not as powerful in the U.S. system as it is the case with an increasingly militarized and securitized state in Iran. Also, the argument of people who have vested interests, economic interests in the status, I don't think it applies as much, even though people who are benefiting from their lobbying against this. But this is not the main driving force. To be honest with you, I think the main driving force is truly ideological. Those people who believe that, anything short than toppling this regime is not in the interest of U.S. and Israel, and primarily even Israel. Those are the people who have opposed this agreement and have tried to undermine. And it's interesting, Borzo, their criticism of this deal and why the U.S. military effort or sanctions haven't worked isn't that, the concepts that they have advocated for are misguided. Their criticism is that the execution hasn't been perfect. That maximum pressure in its first term wasn't really pursued as seriously as it should have been. Or that in the second term, the ultimate pressure that President Trump put in place wasn't really truly, we were just one set of sanctions away from achieving the objective, or that a few more weeks of bombing, or if the blockade had stayed in place for another few weeks or months, that all of these, it's always a question that a little bit more coercion will magically get you to where you want to go. Isn't that Iran was not going to or ever going to surrender under pressure. And so they have been discredited, but that doesn't mean that they've been silenced or they would stop advocating for what they've been advocating for years, including, by the way, by smearing and discrediting people who have been vindicated by the development, which are the diplomacy camp.
Yeah. And so who are we talking about? There are several different camps that are, in favor of destroying any kind of diplomacy between Iran. There are the congressional Republicans and some Democrats as well. There are people in the think tanks. There are people in the lobbying organizations and so on. Do they work together? Do you know? Are they in tandem? Are there shades of gray? Are some a little bit more or less hardline than others?
Look,
let's do Kremlinology on Washington.
I do believe that it is an echo chamber in the sense that you see a headline coming out in New York Post or in Iran International that is then picked up by members of Congress, again, members of Congress, and then they would issue a statement or say something that is again picked up by right-wing media in the U.S. And then all of this is picked up by think tanks and the lobbying groups to then again feed the same arguments into the system. So it's really a loop that is constantly aggrandizing the threats of Iran and sort of minimizing or overlooking the risks of a confrontational approach towards Iran, labeling anyone who is pro-diplomacy as a appeaser or mouthpiece of the Islamic Republic. I find all of these arguments actually, if it wasn't tragic, kind of ridiculous, because it's very rare in any foreign policy issue to actually be able to do experiments, do tests of what works and what doesn't work. And we have now a 47-year track record of U.S. pursuing different policies. And guess what? The only time that the U.S. has been able to effectively roll back a problematic Iranian policy has been through diplomacy, through give and take. Nothing else has worked. And in fact, all the other coercive policies, I would say, have backfired.
Yeah. Do you have any insight into how they coordinate their messaging and strategies? I remember some people have told me about like daily email blasts and WhatsApp groups and so on. Are they, like you said, it's an echo chamber. Is it literally an echo chamber? Is it an organized effort on the part of one or two or three nodes? Or is it more informal than that?
Honestly, I don't have a lot of insights into how they do it. I have to admit that the way they used to do it was pretty effective. If they had not, again, burned their cards by pushing too hard and for a policy that was kind of bound to backfire, they would have been in a better position. But that doesn't mean that, again, they didn't have the kind of influence that a lot of other people in Washington dreamed of. I mean, imagine getting almost everything you want, every sanction you want, every, covert operation you were hoping for, every military pressure on Iran that you were hoping. I know the feeling because I got that kind of influence during the JCPOA negotiation. From that point on, it was all a downward spiral, to be honest with you. So I've experienced it for a very short period of time. The other camp, they've had it for a very, very long time, and it's. One has to admit that they've been very effective in what they have tried to do, even though the results have been catastrophic for U.S. national interests, I would say, even for Israel's safety and security, and of course for Iran and the region.
In the end, yeah. What's funny, just as a side note, I thought that, Israel would pay the costs of this misadventure somewhere down the line years from now. I'm like, okay, maybe they'll be successful in this conflict, but there will be a blowback. And what's extraordinary is how quickly that blowback has come in terms of Iran becoming this formidable regional power instead of becoming weakened, and in terms of Israel's global credibility and standing being even more diminished. I want to talk about another group of potential spoilers. You can't say this, but I can say this. I just came up with this. The Ghormeh Sabzi Gusanos, the Pahlavis, the Iranian opposition people who are in the West. They're very loud, they're very noisy. Some do seem to have the ear of the administration. And sadly, they have a point in one respect, in that Iran's horrific human rights track record, its treatment of protesters, the dungeons where the best minds of the country are stored, warehoused for years and years and years, the psychological torture and physical abuse that they are subject to. You know, the regime is in some ways irredeemable. They have a point in that regard. But their solution to take this unemployed Maryland guy and put him in power in Iran is like a fantasy and a pipe dream, not really realistic. What about them? Do they have any chance of ruining the possibility of a kind of a peace becoming more durable? Is their noisiness and their kind of their moral legitimacy to some extent, is that a threat to this memorandum of understanding?
Not anymore. I feel like, again, they tried their best shot. It didn't work. And even from the very beginning of this conflict, Trump refused to meet with Reza Pahlavi, kind of dismissed him as a viable alternative to the Islamic Republic. And now we know that both Israel and the U.S. were considering Netanyahu as a more viable candidate than Reza Pahlavi. Again, I think the peak of their influence is already behind us. And in a way, there's also a lesson, that yes, the U.S. doesn't learn from some of its mistakes in the region and repeats them, but this concept of riding a wave of U.S. military intervention in order to gain power, the kind of Trinity approach to gaining power doesn't really work, and especially in the case of Iran, when you fail to have two key ingredients. One is a ground game, that you have the kind of infrastructure that's inhabited the revolution, network of mosques and charitable organizations that did the legwork of the revolution in Iran. I mean, the monarchists clearly demonstrated that they don't have that network inside the country. And second, the kind of leadership that is able to unify the opposition and cast a broad umbrella, broad coalition, again, in the way that Khomeini did in the run-up to 1970. If you don't have those two things, regardless of how much influence you have in Washington, it's just not going to.
Ali Vaez of the Crisis Group. Hey, thank you so much. Great to see you in any case, at least virtually, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me, Borzu. Enjoyed the discussion.
Again, this is Borzu Dergahi. You've been watching or listening to Badlands. It is my podcast. You can subscribe at borzu.substack.com or on Spotify or YouTube or Apple Podcasts.